Thank you for joining us for today's session. I'm your host, Debbie Mathias with the BUILD Initiative. We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement from Giovanna Archuleta, Assistant Secretary for the New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department.
I would like to open up this meeting acknowledging our Mother Earth and the land she nurtures us with, the land where our children grow, and the land that provides the food to feed them. When we talk about these resources, we must also acknowledge the lands of our tribal people and the deep spiritual and long-standing relationship of all tribal nations. Today I come from you from Nambe-Awinga, the land of my ancestors who cared for it and fought for it so that I may one day live and raise my own children on it. A relationship that predates colonial contact by thousands of years. Our ancestors still speak to us and guide us through our songs, ceremonies, and writings. Through removal, trail of tears, long walks, assimilation, and the idea that by removing children would kill a culture. Our ancestors did not give up. Our tribal people are some of the most resilient people in our country, continuing to raise children to be resilient, who are nurtured through language and culture, the language and culture that cannot be removed. We must also acknowledge all other spirits who were forcefully displaced from their homelands and trafficked for labor and production on sacred native land. All of us collectively continue to experience the adversity that's caused our ancestors and spirits who continue to hurt from actions done to them. Take a moment to pray these people find the healing and peace to raise their children in a world that has so many opportunities, but most importantly, create coexistence free of violence. Tribal people are praying people. This is where we are all tied. Our grandmothers and mothers continue to pray over us. And as tribal people pray, they pray for people in the north, in the east, in the south, and the west. They pray for infants, children, adults, and elders, and our non-human relations, each with knowledge to share with us. As this conference begins, I hope that each of you are balanced in all directions and take a moment to appreciate what Mother Earth has given to us and how she continues to nurture us in many ways. I invite and encourage you to learn who are the original stewards of the land you live and work on and support those nations and children of those lands. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. The BUILD team is excited to present this 20 webinars in 20 days for Quality 2020 as we explore ideas, possibilities, and learn together about how we might create better, more equitable systems with children, families, and early childhood professionals at the center of our efforts. We're grateful to the many individuals who took time to prepare sessions, generate content, and ideas to share. We believe the sessions will inspire you to build on these ideas, continue conversations, and innovate back in your own communities and states. We've learned a great deal as we prepared for virtual events. One of our lessons is that a virtual event draws a much broader audience than an face-to-face conference. The BUILD QRIS conference was designed for early childhood systems leaders at the national, state, territory, tribal, nation, and community levels. As the registrations rolled in for the virtual event, we discovered many direct service providers from teachers to center directors and home-based providers signing up for the sessions. We welcome you to our learning community and look forward to hearing your perspectives. We encourage you to share your comments, ideas, and questions in the chat box. As you know, we had to pivot from our in-person conference to a virtual conference. We'd like to say a sincere thank you to our sponsors who made that switch possible. Next slide. We've all become familiar with the Zoom platform over the past few months, as we have used it to connect with family, friends, community, and colleagues. We want to point out a few features that may be new to you. First, you can choose your view. In the upper right-hand corner, click on Speaker View to see the active speaker, or click on Gallery to see everyone. Next, we encourage you to provide feedback throughout the session by clicking Participants to open up that participant list, and then clicking on the icons along the bottom to respond to questions or give us a thumbs up or other signals about how it's going for you. Why doesn't everybody try it right now? Give me a thumbs up or a yes over in the participant box. All right, I can see some people getting onto it. Let's use that. Okay, all right, great. Thank you, everyone. Okay, don't forget to chat with us. We encourage you to be active participants in this session. Please share your ideas, experience, and questions in the chat box. If there are polls in the session, a box will pop up on your screen, and we encourage you to respond. This helps us generate more conversation and enhances our learning together. Now I'd like to turn it over to Marsha Basloe, to introduce our session leaders and launch our session. Hi, Marsha, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks so much. So welcome to our session on building leadership for systems development and sustainability, essential skills and traits. My name is Marsha Basloe, and I'm president of Child Care Services Association in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area of North Carolina. This session focuses on how to find and recruit the next generation of early childhood leaders. It also focuses on leaders that are focused on systems development. So we really want to hear from you. We want to have you think about who helped you. You know, how did you start your career? And put that information in the chat box. We're going to have Kate Irish with Kate Irish Consulting. Kate is waving. She is going to actually man our chat box. So she's going to be looking for some of the things that you're going to be able to write in. She's going to take your questions that you have so that when we have time for questions, we're going to be able to answer some of them. So please, we do really want to hear from you. Let us know how you started your career, who helped you. We are going to be discussing the technical and interpersonal skills needed to foster leadership. And we're going to talk about the strategies to recruit, nurture, and support a diverse range of leadership over time and across geography. We really have some gifted panelists who are going to go through this. And so what I'd like to do is just to have them begin by introducing themselves. And I will call on Sarah first and have Sarah introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Heinemeier. I'm with Compass Evaluation and Research here in Durham, North Carolina. And I'm so pleased to be with all of you today. Shannon, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Shannon Rudisill, and I'm the Executive Director of the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, which is a national collaborative, but I'm based out of the Washington, D.C. area. And I will turn it over to Khari.
Shannon, thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Khari Garvin. I'm Executive Director of the Head Start Operations for Save the Children Federation, and I've been on post for almost 4 years and very pleased to be here. I'll kick it over to Andy.
And Andy will come back in a couple of minutes, and we'll have him introduce himself at that time. So if we can go to the next slide. So these are the goals that we have for our session. And really, leadership is not a new topic. Many of you wrote in your comments when you registered that you were interested in learning about ways to enhance leadership and identify and support emergent leaders. In fact, last week in New America, Stacy Goffin and Elliot Regenstein discussed the need to elevate leadership development. Stacy and Elliot indicated that they are advocating for comprehensive leadership development and the development of dedicated, as opposed to generic, programs that speak to early childhood's leadership needs. And we know in what we've just lived through that we do need to have early childhood leadership needs. So today, we would like to discuss this issue in more depth. Our goals today are to further discuss the need to find and support emergent leadership, emergent leaders, or the individuals who are willing to take on those executive leadership positions in the near future. In doing so, we are focused on what states, communities, and agencies can do to build the leaders that they want and need heading into the future. In our discussion today, we will identify several cross-cutting themes and priorities. We will also acknowledge that COVID-19 has created both challenges and opportunities for early childhood. While the pandemic has placed enormous stress on early childhood, it is also highlighting the importance of early childhood for supporting both educational and economic success. And then finally, we will present some strategies and tools that states and communities might use to move leadership development forward. We welcome your comments, questions, and feedback as well. And before I turn it over to Sarah, I'll just mention that our agenda is we're going to have a conversation with our panelists. We're going to have 3 panelists and a discussant present. And then we're going to turn it over to you when we want to hear from you. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Heinemeier.
Next slide, please. As Marsha just mentioned, our goals today are to discuss the need to find and support emergent leaders. And these are the individuals who might take on executive leadership positions in the near future. And in doing so, we're focused on what states, communities, and agencies, what they can do to build the leaders that they'll want and need heading into the future. Now, to respond to that question or that need, we believe we need to address several things. We need to address the vision for emergent leadership. We encourage states, communities, or agencies to think of emergent leaders as unique and distinct from existing leaders. And this may involve asking the question, are we looking to replicate the current cohort of executive leadership, or do we need to intentionally recruit and support individuals with different skill sets, proficiencies, and different worldviews? We also want to recognize that the goal isn't necessarily to identify professionals who transition to state leadership, but that we also need to develop leaders who will remain in local communities and nurture the interface between state policy and regulations and local implementation and responsiveness. We believe we also will need to address specific leadership skills and traits. As we'll talk about today in our session, emergent leadership includes opportunities that target interpersonal skills, the ability to communicate vision, passion, hope, along with development of practical skills that executive leaders need in order to have mastered and good stewardship of public resources. We need to address how we will find our emergent leaders and strategies or tools for building a pipeline of talented mid or early career professionals who can receive and participate in those different opportunities. This can include different mentorship, fellowship, instruction, or other forms of collaborative peer learning opportunities. States or communities also may see a benefit in ongoing membership or networking for emergent leadership in order to facilitate long-lasting collaboration and professional development. Next slide, please. We also believe that there are several cross-cutting themes that should be addressed in an emergent leadership initiative. These include a focus on intentional equity. By intentional equity, we mean the strategies or tools states and communities might use to become more equitable. These strategies and tools might be designed to move a community from learning about and acknowledging structural racism and inequality to actually responding to it and making progress towards greater equity. We believe we need to address sustainability. Stacy and Elliott, in their New America piece, noted that leadership development programs can be short-lived. Therefore, the sustainability of emergent leadership development should be a focus and goal for any initiative. We need to think about cross-sector collaboration. Early childhood is complicated, and it involves different sectors, different tiers, different funding streams. How can a state or community build an emergent leadership initiative that is comprehensive and works to support systems building collaborations? We need to think about adaptiveness and responsiveness. As Marsha noted, COVID-19 is highlighting the importance of adaptability at state and local levels and the need for our systems and programs to be flexible in responding to critical needs. How can we help our emergent leaders become nimble and skilled at navigating policy and program boundaries while also ensuring we can respond to changing or escalating needs? We need to think through local and state interface and alignment. We can envision in the not so distant future, states where some emergent leaders transition into state leadership positions, while others focus on local or regional leadership activities. And this is a goal, a network of leaders who work collaboratively to implement state policy and regulations, while also acknowledging and responding to different local or regional needs. The key here is constructive alignment between state and local offices, as well as other agencies and organizations involved in the work of early childhood, and collaborative working relationships. And then finally, we need to think through interpersonal and practical skills. As mentioned earlier, our leaders have to have capacity to bring people together towards a unifying vision or goal. At the same time, leaders, and especially leaders perhaps at smaller or mid-sized offices or agencies, they need a suite of practical skills that cover fairly prosaic activities, including financial oversight, program management, resource or fund development, marketing and communications, strategic planning, and so on. We want to encourage states and communities to think about both skill sets and to provide opportunities for development in each. We also would like to encourage states and communities to think about training and development for the groups that will hire our emergent leaders, so that we can help boards or committees think through the types of leaders that they want and will hire. At this point, I'm going to transition back to Marsha, and she will take us into the next portion of our session.
Okay, thanks so much, Sarah. So I actually get the fun part. I get to actually ask our panelists a couple of questions. And so we're going to start with Shannon. Shannon, you talked about your role, and we've also seen you in other leadership roles at ACF. Tell us a little bit about your current role, how you started in your career, and really, most importantly, who helped you?
I'm very excited to be here, and I'm actually really enjoying the chat. So just a shout out to everybody who's putting their stories in the chat box. So I appreciate that. So currently, I work with philanthropists and thinking about how philanthropists come together to make change in early childhood. And as Marsha mentioned, prior to that, I worked at the Administration for Children and Families. I took a relatively traditional path. So as I've been looking at the chat box, I see a number of people who were in AmeriCorps or Teach for America. And I'll put a pin in this. There's a big role for Head Start here, Khari. I'm noticing that you and I and I came up with through a program for master's degree students after you graduate called the Presidential Management Fellowship, which is for people going into the federal government. It's a very intentional management program at the federal government. But this whole preparation with you, Marsha, got me thinking about some of the people who helped me in the very beginning, because when I applied to master's degree programs, I got a master's in social work. I applied to several colleges, including one that I had always dreamed of going to that I won't name, because when I went there, I got a sense that it was big and prestigious and like you were lucky to be there. And that was sort of the attitude. And then I went to another school, also very prestigious, but with a totally different attitude, Washington University in St. Louis, with their master's program at the Brown School. And they just made mentorship key to the whole thing. They made it very clear during the recruitment process, we're going to match you with executive directors in town in St. Louis. We're going to provide you with mentors while you go through the process. And I was lucky enough to have mentors at school and also great mentors in my field placements, which I think is, you know, is something we should be doing even more of in early childhood. When I think back to the seminal role that my field placements had, you know, a lot of you, I think, looking at the chat, probably are in positions to have graduate students come into your programs or to do student teaching. And I will tell you, that was a seminal experience for me. And as I went along, I got other really fantastic mentors we could talk about, but I'm interested to hear my co-panelists.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm going to turn to Khari. Since we actually have a lot going on with Head Start, tell us a little bit about your work, how you started in your career, and really who helped you as you were going through your career.
Be happy to. And again, good afternoon, everyone, and perhaps good morning to some, depending on where you're logging in from. So, look, first of all, I just want to say my heart warmed over 1,000 times when I saw all the people with the explicit Head Start connections. Saying, yeah, you know, I was a family advocate. I was this, I was that. So, shout out to Head Start. But anyways, my current role, again, I'm executive director of Save the Children Head Start operations, and we operate a portfolio of Head Start programs. We actually operate 6 Head Start programs across, you know, 3 different regions of the country. We're in the Great Plains region, the southeastern and southern regions of the United States. And so we have this portfolio of programs, and really happy to be connected in that way. But I started in early childhood education in general, and explicitly in Head Start. Some would probably say that my trajectory probably was a top-down versus one, because I started as a Head Start fellow, right? So I was assigned to the, at that time it was the Head Start Bureau. It wasn't the Office of Head Start, but I got a glimpse of Head Start from the national perspective, and then left that opportunity and then went to the grantee level, and then sort of stayed there for a number of years, and then with the state collaboration office for a bit. But that's how I sort of came into Head Start. And in terms of who helped me, Marsha, there were many people along the way, and most of them probably don't even realize that they helped me, because I latched onto them informally, just really sort of looking at the way that they navigated through this world and navigated through this space, and learned so many things. In fact, I'm actually amazed at how my thinking, my views, I mean, even things that I say channel those influencers from along the way. But I have had, my point is that I've had some formal relationships in this space where people have mentored me, but I have kind of created a mentorship informal ones along the way, where I really learned from smart people, men who are as represented in space, but women in particular, who really sort of nurtured my growth and development. And I'm very, very thankful for that. And so I'll just close by saying that has come in the space of people who I've reported to, but then also just contacts around the country where our work is intersected, and then I've sort of cultivated that relationship along the way. So I just want to mention that, and thank you.
Marsha, I think you're muted.
Yep, I'm just checking to see if Andy came back on. Do we have Andy here yet? Okay, we'll keep going. Andy will join us. He's clearly having some communications problems with his computer. So I'm going to go back to Shannon, and if you, now that you are at an executive level position, what do you wish that you would have known at the beginning of your career?
Oh, this is a very complicated question at the moment, because there are so many things every day because of everything that's going on in our country. There are so many things every day that I think, if I had thought of it this way, if I had known this when I was in government, what would I have done differently? So I was thinking about this a lot. So a few things that I wish I had known. So I feel like if we had a better analysis, I will just say, if I had a better analysis about how racism had impacted all aspects of the way that we structure early care and education. I wonder some of the decisions I made along the way in terms of policy, would I have made different decisions? Would I have emphasized different things? Would I have, you know, had different priorities if I had a better analysis of the way that racism was shaping things at the time? Similarly, you know, with dual language learners, families for whom English is a second language, families who are new immigrants, it's not that I'm unconcerned about these populations or that I think I haven't done good work. I'm proud of the work I've done. But there's just a lot of things lately that I'll read something and I'll think, all right, like if I could have applied this knowledge over the course of 20 years, what would I have maybe done differently? And if I found one thread that our definitions of quality and the way that we talk about things perpetuate across a bunch of things, race and a bunch of other things, perpetuate the individualization of our problems in the US. Like, we tend to put everything on the individual. And when we think about, like, even the use of the term achievement gap, which I've moved away from, a lot of us have, but let's face it, a lot of us were using that term for a long time because it helped us sell different agendas in ECE. You know, if you think about terms like achievement gap, if you think about terms like the word gap, I mean, the way we talk about things and the way that we work, I think it perpetuates this idea that the issues and the solutions reside within individuals, be they teachers or children or parents. And I actually think we've got systemic problems and the solutions are systemic. So even as we build early childhood systems, sometimes within that, we find ourselves kind of buying into some things that have this individualization problem. And if I had had a different way of thinking about that, maybe I would have rejected that language more often, or maybe I could have done a little deeper work.
Okay. It goes back to systems and the systems development and the learning about systems as a young leader, moving to be an executive leader. I'm going to move to Khari, and then I hear that Andy is on and he's going to get both questions at the same time. So Khari, why don't I ask you, what is it that you wish you had learned, you'd known at the beginning of your career that you now know?
I appreciate that, and I appreciate Shannon's thoughts on that point too. For me, it's I know you ask what I wish I had known now. I'm going to cheat and say that there's something that I wish that I had done differently. And then as a result of that, there are things I would have learned. But I was a younger man when I entered this space, and so at that time, I think that I wish I had paced myself a bit more. And what I mean by that is that you get so excited about having opportunities to be in certain positions, and then at the front of your mind, I think maybe I was a little too concerned about opportunities for advancement, and maybe didn't take the time to settle in earlier on into where I was, to really milk where I was for all it was worth. And I think I've slowed the pace down. I'm learning now in my older age to pace myself in that way. But because I didn't do that from the beginning, I fear that I probably missed some things that I could have gotten. It took me longer to get them because I was focused on some different things at the time. So,
thank you. So really the advice is slow down and actually smell the roses and learn as we go along as well. So thanks. I see Andy has now joined us. So
yes,
thanks,
Marsha,
Khari.
can you hear me?
We can hear you, Andy. We're gonna have you answer both questions now. We're gonna start with you.
Sure.
And I know you from when you were in New Mexico working in early intervention. And so tell us a little bit about how you started your career and really who helped you in the beginning of your career.
Yes, thanks, Marsha. I just want to say apologies for my internet connection. I think we're all going to have new anxiety dreams that are less about showing up to work with no pants on or showing up to do a presentation and it's on the wrong topic. Our new anxiety will be that our internet will let us down when we're supposed to be doing a presentation. So yeah, Marsha, you and I met. My background is primarily in early intervention, Part C. More recently, having left being the state director of the Part C program in New Mexico, I'm now doing consulting with other states around early intervention and more broadly around systems work in early childhood, early learning. And I think there are some things that the early childhood system can learn from Part C, and I benefited from in my early days. And that is, and I think Head Start has some of these institutional things in place too. And I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but through our state interagency coordinating councils, it creates a platform, an opportunity for people to experience leadership. Whether that be parents, and interagency coordinating councils have parents on the councils as well as providers, provide those opportunities. And I know they did for me to show up, and maybe at your first meeting you don't say anything because you're like, well, no one wants to hear from me. But the next meeting, maybe.
Okay. We'll see if he comes back. We'll give him a minute or two, but I'm guessing that he was going to say at the next meeting, you maybe feel a little bit more comfortable and you're able to actually talk. So we will give a chance for Andy to come back, and he's really going to be able to do a presentation for us later. So I want to thank all of our panelists for actually answering the questions. I'm not going to ask you the third question because I want us to move through the presentations. And so we're going to move to the next slide. And so what we are going to do is we're going to have presentations. I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. They really have spent some time really thinking about what they want to share with the group around emergent leadership. So Shannon, I am turning it to you.
Next slide. So I started big picture here. And so hopefully, we have a traditional way that we've thought about leadership that I think a lot of us have used this framework. I'll say I think the first person that taught me this framework was one of my mentors, Dr. Jill Lombardi, and it's many people use this framework when we think about the skills that are needed, both as you're kind of developing intellectually and also as you're implementing things. And that's this research, policy, practice frame, and that you always need to keep all three of these in mind. And so I've talked many times about this framework and encouraged people to think about how they're using all of these different things. Where we are at this moment, where I am with this though, is like, it's not so much about mastering these, but how are we going to critically question within each of these buckets, right? It's kind of my first, it goes along with one of my first answers is like, all right, what are the critical questions that we need to be asking? It's not enough to just say, I understand the dominant kind of research that we do, and I understand methodologies, and I understand like evidence and RCTs, or it's, or I understand the legislature and why I need to advocate and who's on this committee, and I need to be able to give testimony. All that stuff is important, but where I'm getting to now is like, okay, but what are the critical questions we need to ask? And I just put some examples here, but these are just my examples. Like y'all would have your own examples, I think. But I mean, for research, right? I feel like we've gone a little bit too far down. We've tied ourselves up in knots about evidence and evidence base and what counts as evidence and whose definitions of evidence in a way that prioritizes certain kinds of you know, randomized controlled trials and certain kinds of statistical analysis, and that stuff can be important, but that's not the only thing, right? I mean, I've seen much less qualitative research that helps us understand the experience of people, you know, teachers, families, communities. Not a lot of action research, which I don't know too much about, but it like blends together, like action and research at the same time by people who are actually trying to make change in community. And I feel like we need to rebalance a little bit here, and that whenever we're talking about evidence-based practices and how we're presenting it, we should be asking ourselves more questions. And similarly with policy, you know, it comes down to who's at the decision-making table. And I think we do a lot of, those of us who've been in policy positions and those of us who maybe have gone to talk to policymakers, right? You do a lot of listening sessions and this kind of thing. I think we do, with the exception of Head Start and to some degree IDA, much less shared governance, much less like, how are we actually making decisions together? And how does that shape policy? And so I feel like we could really be strengthening that muscle. And in practice, that's such a big bucket, but I'll just say a couple things that came to mind are really, we need to critically examine the biases and how we are defining good practice. We need to look at how we're going to pursue workforce equity against a backdrop of systemic racism in higher ed. And we know our ECE wages differ, even when you have the same degree based on race, we still have race differences. As I mentioned earlier, we need to think about the language that we use to describe practice. And, you know, I've always been a skeptic of this language thing. Like, I mean, I just have no patience for meetings where we sit around and we talk about language and we say we're going to switch the words and then we do. And like, I'm a bit of a skeptic, but I really think that it's not so much just changing the language, but like, what are the assumptions underlying that, and how are we going to change the assumptions underlying it, right, is something that's been in my mind. And then I didn't even write measurement on here, but I think, you know, we have a lot of questions about how we've been measuring. I was talking with some leaders in family childcare, Latina leaders in family childcare, who were really saying, like, why has trust never been a part of our quality measurement? We talk about it, but then we kind of measure everything else, and why not trust, right? So I think we need to have an opportunity to question a lot of things about within this framework. Next slide. And then in terms of, this sort of flows from the previous slide, you know, I would say there are a lot of technical things that you need to master to be in this field. We have created a very complicated, it's complicated anyway, but we tend to make it more complicated. Like, our payment systems are complicated, our measurement is complicated. Like, we take a human endeavor that's complicated and we make it more complicated, which means we have a lot of technical skills we need, right? Like, whatever those technical skills are, it may range from how to manage your budget to the measurement tool you're using and being valid and reliable to any number of things. But I don't think the biggest challenges are the technical challenges. The biggest challenges are the adaptive challenges. And so I just, you know, listed out here some of the adaptive challenges that are on my mind, right? About what can we, I mentioned this already, participatory governance. Like, how could we get there? I lay awake at night wondering, like, okay, how could we have done this better when I was at ACF? Like, I feel like I was good at listening to people and meeting with parents, but like, there was no system of participatory governance at the federal level, I'll tell you that. Equity, I think we've been talking a little bit about equity, and there's so many questions there for me about how we move forward with equity and questioning our assumptions. I really wanted to call out creating a culture of welcome and inclusion. A quarter of all the kids in the United States are growing up in immigrant families. So this isn't somebody else's issue. This is our community. This is who are our kids. And almost 20% of all the people working in the field are immigrant women. And I think we've been on defense around immigration now for quite a number of years. But like, what will it mean to transcend that in the future and actually create a welcoming, where this is an asset. It's a huge asset. This is a huge asset for our country. And so how do we really embrace it? And I'm going to look at my time, Marsha, because I know you have a packed agenda. So I'll just say a couple more things. I feel like we need to be willing to take more risks. I think we need to be willing to, and the reason I thought of that was because I was like, well, what would that really mean, this stuff I'm talking about? Like, to share power, to say I'm not going to use this measurement that is validated, because I think it, that's risky, and I don't want to minimize it. It risks funding, it risks difficult conversation with your funders. These are risky conversations. So to do any of this, that's a big one, and I am risk averse. So I am not gonna stand up here and like pretend I'm not and that I'm preaching. So I think that's a growth area, willingness to take risks. And then, last, I think for those of us in government, and I don't know how many folks are in government reading the chat, I thought we might have more. One thing I noticed when I was in the federal government is that I talked a lot with staff, and we tried to like incorporate more site visits and all these things, but that was surprisingly tough because you get totally engulfed. This might be the same with center directors talking to parents or going to, hang out in the community. You got so much on your plate. Like, how are you going to make room to actually go, sit in an eligibility interview and like watch the madness that goes on and make yourself reckon with it, right? Or like, how are you going to do that? How are you going to talk to staff about that when honestly they could get through their day without ever doing that? And so I feel like that is something I worked out hard but never got as far as I wanted to. And I think no matter where you are, thinking about like how you make the time for you and your staff to be in the experiences that all the folks you're working with are in is a critical question.
Thank you, Shannon. I think what I want to do is see if Kate is on. Do we have a couple of questions that might have come in for Shannon before we move on, Kate?
No, we haven't had, I don't think we've had any questions for Shannon while she was talking this time. We had some comments about what she was saying in her last segment on racial equity. But I don't see any questions. People can write in now if they want to.
Shannon, in what you were talking about with the traditional picture of research, policy, and practice, you were talking a lot about some of the changes that you would have made at the federal government. How is it impacting your decision making as a funder?
So philanthropy it's a different animal. Let me say that. It's a really different animal. But I think that I don't fund, but I have a learning community of funders. And actually we do. Actually, we started one program based on a gap that we identified together, which was around community organizing in childcare, because we felt like direct community organizing was a missing ingredient. And we actually got a bunch of funders to put together a pool fund to fund community organizing. And we funded 9 grants in 9 different states to actually directly work with parents and teachers around organizing for improvements in childcare. So I would say that's one thing. I think that a lot of what we've been talking about in the education that we're doing together as funders learning together is around, we're having a lot more parents come speak. And one thing that we're learning is if you're working on equity, you're also working on direct voice of families and parents and teachers. Like, originally we started these 2 things, like we're going to work on racial equity and we're going to work on having more people come and talk to us and be learning with us who are parents or teachers or directly in the field. And then it started to merge together like this. And we realized like that wasn't 2 things, right? That was 1 thing. And so I feel like we're baby steps, but that's how we're working on some of it now.
Okay. So I am going to thank you, and we'll have a chance at the end to ask questions of all of our panelists, but I am going to move us to Khari and have Khari introduce himself and have him talk about leadership and emergent leadership. And we'll move to the next slide. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you for that, Shannon. Thank you for that. I want to pull on that string that you, maybe, I hope we have time to do it at the end, but that string of, you talked about, you know, risk aversion and really, I do think that certainly has an impact on leadership and our approach to that as well. I think there's something there, so we should talk about that. But anyway, appreciate those thoughts. Next slide, please, as we jump in here. I'm gonna shift the focus just a little bit to talk about some practical implications for recruiting and developing leadership in rural places. And so we'll focus on rural communities, and that just has everything to do with the fact that much of Save the Children's US work is rurally focused, and that strategy or that idea extends to our Head Start work as well. So there are some critical factors that impact leadership recruitment in general, but certainly in rural places. And so I just want to point out here that number one, there is a tendency towards smaller leadership talent pools. And I want to be very, very careful as I describe this. I am not at all saying that talented people don't exist in rural places. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that they are fewer in number because there are fewer people in rural places. And so that kicks up a sort of a different sort of or interesting concern here. Okay, so there's lesser availability in the marketplace, just, you know, due to sheer numbers, and that's really the point I'm making. And then you know, married to that there are also, you know, there are commonly fewer institutions of higher education in rural places. So that means now you have fewer opportunities to access either those training hubs that you need, or colleges, universities, and certainly colleges and universities and other training hubs that would offer the desired areas of focus that you might want, especially for early childhood education. So all of this kind of makes it kind of a tough thing to kind of wrestle with when you're talking about recruiting and developing early childhood education leaders in these rural places, right? And so what you find then is that as those numbers tend to be a bit smaller, we find ourselves fiercely competing for that talent in these places, and, you know, with school districts and state government and other nonprofits, or we find ourselves recycling talent. Right? I mean, so you have, you know, you'll have individuals who will sort of bounce from place to place to place. And it's just not good for the field, right? Because it's very difficult. And all of that with the backdrop of, you know, Head Start just having become enormously complicated to run, right? I mean, it has really morphed over these 20 years in a way that that you really just need to, we need to all have the ability to have that leadership that can handle many things. And so that's kind of the situation and circumstance where we are. And so I'll just ask, this is the idea, but I'll ask to click to the next slide, please, as we continue kind of talking about this, right? And so now, there are some societal considerations as well, and so you see that on the slide. I just want to just talk a bit about the impact of migration patterns, right? So in most of the places where we operate our Head Start programs, and again, we are in rural America, the Great Plains regions, southern, southeastern parts of the country, the net migration impact on our work is something real and really neat that we also have to take into consideration as well. In most places where we operate, the net migration rate is negative. And what that means is, I mean, that's the way it's classified or defined. So what that means is there are actually fewer people who move into our service area than there are those who move out of the service area, right? So what does that mean? Well, number one, that means that our talent pool, not just for early childhood education, but really across the board, but with the emphasis being early childhood education, the talent pool is actually shrinking. It's not growing, right? We actually have fewer people coming into the service area than who leave, number one. But then also too, this signals something else, that because of the net migration rate being negative or classified that way in most places where we operate, that also signals this fact, that the workforce in these service areas today and the workforce tomorrow, those workforces are more likely to be made up of those who are currently there rather than outsiders who would be coming into the space. Right? Now, I want to make sure that we understand that point. Right? So this is what we're confronted with. It's not a criticism, it's not a judgment. I'm just sharing that's how it is. All right. So then it leads us to this point. So next slide, please, if you'll click. So now we've had to change, and you'll see the word there shaded on screen. So for us, we've had to change the conversation from recruiting to developing our talent and our leadership, because in the places where we are, again, the likelihood for us to be able to actually recruit someone into our service area, it's not as plentiful to us. And so we've changed the conversation in that way in terms of our work, right? And so that's just a different way of saying that for us, we almost are laser focused on growing our talent from within, right? And that's the way that we have to really build our leaders. And then I would also just come back to this idea, and I'll tell you how I think a better way for us to get at that, and I'll sort of end with that idea. But I wanted to say one more thing about these net migration rates and the negative net migration rates, and really what that also does for us. I believe that the net migration rate, or the negative net migration rate, where we have fewer individuals coming into the service area than those who leave, that actually makes the case for business investment in leadership, right? Because, and that investment should be in leadership development as well as early childhood education investment, because the child who is in school right now in these communities is more likely to be part of the business community's workforce later on than not, right? Because again, either that child, that person, that family, those individuals who are being developed in these rural places, they're either going to leave, as the data would show, or if they remain, they're going to be the ones who would be the next managers and business owners and frontline workers and so on and so forth. And so, because again, you're going to have fewer individuals moving or relocating to these areas. So to me, or for us at least, this makes the case for business and also really for government, local government that is, to really invest in leadership development, to cultivate the talent that's already there, because we're probably not going to get very many people coming in to grow our talent pool. So the next slide, and I'll just close with this set of ideas then. So here are a couple of strategies that we think, or that we're finding serve our purpose, and I think can really help with the leadership development in these rural places. So number one, this idea of implementing a system of leadership development and then having some community or regional leadership networks. And so here's the premise, that the idea for us is to develop within these local communities and these rural communities a set of leadership core competencies. Perhaps those are embodied in some sort of credential or some sort of endorsement, but it would cut across the industry widely in a way so that everyone who was a leader in the industry would all sort of be trained up with the same sorts of skills and abilities and knowledge and so on and so forth. And then you compensate based on the attainment of that credential, right? So what that means for us is, so now if I am in this rural place, or I am in a populous or metropolitan place. If I have this credential, which everyone endorses, everyone agrees that these are the things that effective leaders need to know and understand, and these are experiences they need to have, then I am valued the same way in the rural community or the metropolitan community, because I've earned that credential and I'm being compensated the same way. So what does that do? Well, first of all, it disincentivizes individuals from leaving the local community, because they know that they can make this much money and be regarded and valued in this way here as much as they would in other places, number one. And number two, it really sort of ends the local competition, the local fight for getting those precious few individuals, because everyone is sort of now cut from the same cloth. And so
Khari, you are setting us up for when we actually talk about our self-assessment.
Okay.
And so I do appreciate that you're doing that, but I am going to have to stop and move us on to our next presenter. But you know, you've done a great job of setting that up. So I thank you.
Sorry for going so long, Marsha.
No,
sorry.
Thank you very much. Andy, we are going to move to you, and I'm going to turn it over to you so that you can have the floor.
Oh, great. And again, apologies for my internet connection. You would have been laughing, Marsha, at me running down to a neighbor's house with laptop in hand, but I think I have stable internet. I think this, you know, is a lesson, and a lot of our families are dealing with internet connections with the remote learning and in early intervention telehealth. So I've certainly been empathizing with our families this morning with that. I'm going to talk a little bit. I want to build on what Khari was saying about community level leadership and that idea of competencies. I am going to give some examples, if you want to go to the next slide, from early intervention. And I started to say this, I think, before I was cut off before that. I think there are some things we can learn from early intervention around building leadership. I think there's some structures there, but I think the challenge is what Khari sort of ended there with, and it sounds like, Marsha, you're going to be talking about with the self-assessment tool. How can we build these leaderships across systems so that they're not within Head Start, within childcare, or in my case, looking here at early intervention, but building leadership opportunities and being really intentional about that across systems. But if I can focus just for a minute, I do think a lot of it is opportunities that we give to people to move into leadership opportunities. And I think I said earlier that I was excited to see in the chat a parent who started on an interagency coordinating council. In New Mexico, we would have parent panels where a parent would be invited. They'd get coached, mentored prior to coming to an ICC so that they were ready to tell their story. And often they would be very nervous about that. Why would these state leaders and regional leaders want to hear from me and my story? Not realizing how powerful those stories are. And we experienced that just having people come and tell their story, that then they might be the next parent who would volunteer to be part of the council. So now they have an even stronger voice than just showing up to one council meeting. Maybe they then find their way into a work group where their voice as a parent is listened to. Maybe from that, they might even volunteer for the statewide, folks are probably familiar that the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, funds parent training and information centers, often made up of both paid staff, but a lot of volunteers. And so that's another opportunity where parents can move into those leadership positions. And we took that really seriously in seeing it as a pipeline for building the next generation of leaders. It helped that one of my mentors and leaders was a parent leader. She came up through the system, and I know Head Start, this is very strong, that parent leadership in Head Start also. So we had as our state director prior to me, a parent who had run the state Part C, most Part C early intervention system. And we know that most of the parent training and information centers, not all of them, but most of them are run by parents themselves. So seeing those opportunities as pipelines, and here I've mostly focused on parents, but I think the same thing can be said for providers. The ICC requires both 25% parent membership, so you're required to recruit parents, but then you also have 25% early intervention providers, and they often go through that same thing. What have I got to say? Are people really going to listen to me? And a lot of ICCs set up a mentorship program for providers also, so that if they're the new provider on the council, that they get support. So I think, and then being part, and providers can then be part of work groups so that they can feel like they're making a change in the system, whether that's policy, whether that's going to the state legislature to advocate for additional funding or policy change, and really supporting them to find their voice in that. So I think providing lots of opportunities. I think there are other opportunities as well as local boards of organizations where parents and others can find their voice as part of local agency boards. A lot of states have state advisory councils for early childhood, or state early learning councils. They're called different things in different states. That's another opportunity where people can find their voice, start to advocate, learn about policy change, and really be part of a system's look at early childhood. Often there, you're looking outside of just your early childhood system, but looking across the system in your state. And many states, and a growing number of states, as well as having a state advisory council, will have local councils or hubs, or Smart Start in North Carolina, Marsha, I know you're very familiar with, which also provides an opportunity for people to find that leadership voice and hopefully be supported in that. And then, of course, there's professional organizations and national organizations that people can find opportunities to be part of, either a standing panel, or organization that's working on something, or a national board. So those are the opportunities. Let's move to the next slide, where I think we can look at how can we really be intentional. Those are the opportunities, but I think there's really ways that we can be, and I think the self-assessment, Marsha, goes into this somewhat, is how can we really be intentional about supporting people that goes beyond just providing the opportunities. And many states and organizations have examples of this, where they set up a conference track for leaders. So you can sign up, I want to go to a leadership track, and I'm going to take the workshops within that conference that are going to enhance my leadership skills. I'm going to learn about systems approaches. I'm going to learn about how bills are made, policy is made. Other folks have leadership academies where people come in for 2 or 3 days. They form a cohort with others around the state where they learn together. Maybe they go back and they commit to doing some leadership work in their community on a volunteer basis, and then come back later in the year. Fellowships are kind of an example of that also, and I think we've got examples that we can look to. 0 to 3 has a wonderful fellowship, and I think states could look to develop fellowships where people get to learn about systems thinking and about leadership. And finally, I think there's other examples of more long-term training courses. LEND is one that is on an interdisciplinary approach. It talks about neurodevelopmental disorders, but it's really about disabilities in general. So people are learning alongside each other. Therapists are learning alongside doctors, who are learning alongside parents. An interdisciplinary approach to training around leadership. I think we've talked a little bit today about the importance of mentorship and coaching, whether that's formalized, and I think here I'm really recommending that we look at formalizing. A lot of ICCs, as someone comes in, will be assigned a mentor or a coach. where they can be supported. I know organizations also do that through reflective supervision. And then similar to that, communities of practice where people get to learn together. Maybe they come together for a monthly webinar on leadership and learn together and discuss together their challenges or their successes. And I think being intentional around some of those things can be really helpful. And finally, I think, Marsha, you're going to talk about the self-assessment, but I think there's, and Khari, you talked about this in terms of regional, having some competencies and a structured training. And there's examples I think we can look to. The Division of Early Childhood, the professional organization for early childhood special educators, has developed some leadership competencies. So I think there's some things we can definitely look to. And then finally, if you could just go to the last slide, I'll go through this real quickly. I think that organizations, whether they be a local organizations, a state organization, even national organizations, can really promote a culture that folks understand that leadership is being valued. And so that's not just talked about at the executive level, but we talk about, and in our literature, in our websites, in communication that goes out and trainings, that we value leadership at the local community, that we value it at the team level. I think organizations also need to be explicit about valuing diversity in leadership, and we've talked a little bit about that today, and really making sure that people from diverse communities are represented on advisory bodies, on work groups, and being really intentional about that. I think organizations could and should be doing that. I think I've talked a fair bit today about the role of parents, and they are the ultimate consumers as well as the kids in our system. And I think they should have a voice, and we should expect them to play leadership roles and then be intentional about supporting them. I think we need to present a culture that that values advocacy, and showing that when people debate and challenge us, that we recognize that we may ultimately go in a different position, but that we validate the positions that people are taking, and that advocacy is valued. And so therefore people see the role of going into leadership is being valued throughout the organization. I think we can award people and value people at national conferences, regional conferences, for their leadership, for advocacy, and so that people can see that it's not just executive leaders, it's people who've stepped up into leadership positions are being recognized and awarded for that. And then finally, as I said earlier, being really intentional about setting up a mentorship and coaching approach where people are supported, not just through the training, but that they have someone that they can turn to in tough times, when they're trying to make decisions about whether they should take a position on something, that they have someone that they can go to for mentorship and coaching. So I think the overall message, Marsha, is, and I think this is something you feel strongly about, is us being really intentional about providing opportunities. What are the supports that we can do, and what are the messages that we're sending within our organizations and structures that shows people that we value leadership?
Andy, thank you very much. In fact, I want to thank all three of our presenters before I turn it to Sarah. And you'll see how different they all looked at this topic, which was the most exciting part of having them put it together. Shannon really had us think critically about the questions that we have to ask as we're beginning to build new leadership. Although I'm not sure, Shannon, I agree that you're risk aversion, but we can talk about that offline. And I think that Khari really helped us to think about developing our leadership, growing our talent from within. And Andy, your background is so perfect about really raising up the voice of parents and promoting the intentional leadership. So I really want to thank all three of you for being part of this presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to talk about the self-assessment tool before we have questions. We are putting together a self-assessment tool that she will talk about that you've all mentioned. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks. You know, what's really striking to me, again, across all presentations is thinking about, well, how do we do this, right? How do we, and the mix of human relational skills, how do we, unite, connect, cajole, while at the same time disrupting old patterns of thinking? How do we do that in a unifying way? That's a human interpersonal skill that we need to look for, but at the same time, practical skills. Some ideas that we've talked about, the need for building staffing, workforce development, business investment, funding, so many kind of practical skills that leaders will need to have if we're going to do this work. And really kind of just struck again, as we talked and heard the presentations, of what states and communities or agencies might need to be thinking about as they think about the mix of skill sets, and how we can help support agencies and communities that are bringing on new leaders and helping them really think through what's going to make a good leader for you heading into the future as well, right? One of the tools we had hoped to bring for you back when the conference was still in person, when we had a longer time, we had set aside time to have a self-assessment and to do some table work around the self-assessment for states and individuals to kind of walk through this assessment. And this assessment that we've developed thinks about emergent leadership in 4 domains. It thinks about it in the domain of vision. How do you define an emergent leader for your state or your community or your agency? How do you conduct a needs assessment around that? And how do you do planning, right? Andy, you mentioned being intentional. How do we do all of this in an intentional, forward-thinking process? What processes do we use to find and engage and train emergent leaders over time? How do we develop an infrastructure to support emergent leadership? What office or offices does it reside in? How does it get funded? And then how do we nurture connections? How do we build networks so that we're nurturing collaborative connections across emergent leaders? And again, all with an intentionality that flows into the future, that says not only where do we want to be kind of today, tomorrow, and a year, but where do we want to be in 5 years? What do we think the hurdles and challenges will be, so that we're being intentional and prospective in our leadership support? I think one of the things we'd like to offer, since we didn't have that table time available in a virtual session, is we will follow up with everyone on today's session with some next steps or ways that you can get a copy of this assessment and participate in it and use it. But one idea that we wanted to make a little bit of time for is the idea, and it's been mentioned several times already, of a fellowship program. And we are delighted to have on our session today as a participant, Gina Federico, and she is with Pennsylvania's Early Intervention Technical Assistance. And we'd like to invite her to say a few words about her experience with a leadership fellowship program. Gina, are you here with us?
I am. Thanks, Sarah. Can
Hi,
you hear
Gina.
me?
Sure can.
Awesome. So thank you, everyone. My name is Gina Federico. I work with Early Intervention Technical Assistance, which is Pennsylvania's Office of Child Development and Early Learning, one of our business partners. And back in 2016, we launched the Pennsylvania Early Learning Policy Fellowship Program. And since then, we have graduated over 40 leaders from the program in cohorts of 8 to 12 or 13 folks every year over the last 4 years. The first year, we had a nomination process where Octel's executive team targeted emerging leaders who they knew. We were sort of on a tight turnaround, you know how grant cycles are, and we do want to thank the Grable Foundation for their initial support of the fellowship and their continued support, as well as the Heinz Endowments for their support of the fellowship as well. But really this came out of a need in Pennsylvania, where we were seeing the same folks at the leadership tables and at stakeholder meetings over and over again. And you know, our then Deputy Secretary and Director of External Relations realized that there was a need to start building leadership pathways as there were going to be retirement vacancies at the state and at the advocacy organizations. And so they developed this fellowship to target emerging leaders from across the state. And we have an online application process, though of course to be equitable, folks can apply through a paper application or even have conversations with me. And we make sure that we have folks from rural communities, from cities, from early intervention, from directors, providers, higher education professionals, advocacy organization professionals, just really folks at sort of either early stages in their career or sort of at a turning point where we know that they're going to be looking for the next step soon, and to help them learn about how state government works. Because we know as a teacher in early childhood or as an early intervention service provider, you might not get that in your on-the-ground daily work. And so we wanted to make sure that our future leaders were being prepared with this knowledge from early on or at a midpoint in their careers. And so we focus on how is policy developed? How does the legislative process work? How do advocates influence that process? And even getting the fellows to go on advocacy visits. And we've had a ton of success. And I think that, one thing that shows we're on the right track with this fellowship is that about every year for the last 3 years, and our current fellowship only ended last month, but we've actually had 2 folks at least join the state in some capacity because their expertise that they showed over the course of the fellowship, we realized there was a need for that to be a continued voice at the state. So we're really proud of it. We have a website where you can learn more information, paoctelfellows.net. I'll put that in the chat box for everybody to see today. I encourage you to take a look at our learning model and curriculum. That's all publicly available. You can see the month-by-month breakdown of the fellowship. It is a 9-month program where folks come to the state once a month for a monthly cohort meeting, and then once a month where they meet with a mentor who they are individually assigned in either an area of interest for them, whether it might be certification. I actually know one of our fellows who's on the call today. She came from a QRIS background, and was working with our Bureau of Certification Services, whether it's early intervention, higher ed, and they work on a project over the course of the year. So it's something they stay in their regular job. They get 2 days or so a month that they come back and work with us. And one thing I just want to be able to hit on Andy's point, we realized over our first 3 years, we didn't have any parent leaders in the fellowship. And so that was something we did have our first parent leader in the fellowship this past year. She actually was a pediatrician by trade in her home country of India. She moved to the United States with her family. Her daughter ended up being enrolled in early intervention services with a diagnosis of autism. She decided to take a step back from her practice to support her daughter's services to make sure she got everything that she needed, and has become a tremendous parent leader through some of our Pennsylvania's leadership programs like P3D, Parents as Partnerships in Professional Development, and other programs. She completed the fellowship, and actually in just a couple of months, she will be our new State Interagency Coordinating Council co-chair. So we're even trying to get more parents involved in the future because whether or not folks come to the state, we really do see a jump in their leadership trajectory, whether it's joining leadership groups in their city or their county, their region, across the board. So we're
Gina,
yes.
I have to say, we were so excited to actually be able to hear that the fellowship that you started during Race to the Top continued,
yes,
and
exactly.
is still going on. And it was just so perfect because it fits so well with our emergent leadership, conversation. We look forward to having you do the self-assessment. And
yes.
then in a year, we think we want to come back and actually say, what did you learn through this process?
Absolutely.
But, so thanks for joining us. We reached out, with the help of Build to be able to reach out to Gina, to be able to be part of our session, since this session was going to be 3.5 hours and she was going to do a session. So we've squeezed it all into 75 minutes. But I do want to see, Kate, are there any questions that have come in that we might want to address? I think we have like 12 minutes in case we have some questions.
Yeah, I think there has been a question about how to get the self-assessment, and it looks like Build has responded that it will be part of the event website. That's correct? That's how folks can get the self-assessment tool?
And so we will be sharing the self-assessment tool. What we actually have right now is a draft self-assessment tool, and we're finishing the guidance document that goes with it, because the self-assessment tool is indicators, and you really need to have the guidance document on how best to use it. So we will be hopefully getting the list. We have the list from Build of everyone on the webinar. I think we're going to get that list. So we'll be able to share that information and see who would like to try to use the self-assessment tool, so that we can learn from you about how well it worked. Sarah, I'm going to turn it to you to have you talk about the self-assessment tool and the guidance document.
No, Marsha, you're correct. The goal is for everyone who's participating to reach out and offer several opportunities. One is to be just to review it, but ideally we'd love to potentially pull together some focus groups and some feedback. It's in its first version, so we know that we need to get your feedback on it and your responses to it in order to make it stronger. But we also are delighted if some of the participants would actually like to use it in your states or your communities or your agencies. So because we're still learning about the tool in general, we want to do a little bit of coordination around that. But one of the nice things about virtual sessions is we do have kind of a track list of everyone who's attended. So please do stay tuned for invitations to participate in the assessment and some learning opportunities there. I think that there was another question that I would like to kind of toss out to our panelists today. And this is from Debbie, noting that she's found the enthusiasm for continuing to learn and a curiosity in working with colleagues around hard questions and challenges as a strong attribute for all leaders. And what have you found to be skills and attributes for emergent leaders to think about? I'd love to have each of our panelists to weigh in on that briefly in some of the time that we have left.
Who would like to start? Khari, we'll start with you because we always started with Shannon.
I just want to be sure I understand the question. So is the question around, I don't know, is it opportunities for discovery in leading? Is that what it's getting at, or am I missing that?
So I think from the chat box, and Debbie, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but from the chat box is, what have you found to be skills and attributes? And actually I'm stealing Kate's job. So I'm so sorry, Kate. But what have you found to be skills and attributes for emergent leaders to think about? Yeah. What are the actual skills and attributes?
I got it. So well, we'll start with the attributes. I mean, that's why I think that this discovery came to my mind. I mean, I think that that's the big one. And what I mean by discovery is not operating from a position or posture where you sort of think that it's all been said, it's all been done, and there's nothing else left for us to learn, or nothing else that can be added to the field. And sometimes being in a leadership role, I think we bring that pressure to ourselves, thinking, okay, I've got to be composed and feel like I've got it all figured out. But I think to the extent that we remain open to discovery, new ideas, and new ways of doing things, I'll just add that to the mix. I think that's an attribute that's important.
Andy?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think maybe the skills and attributes maybe fall into two categories. One being the knowledge and information that emergent leaders need to understand and become more proficient in, whether that's understanding database, data-driven decisions, and understanding how states and systems use data, from, came up a couple of times today, understanding how the legislative process and policy making happens. So what are these actual knowledge pieces that can be part of curriculums? I think the more challenging side of things is the sort of more attributes of what does it take to be a leader? What does it take to find your voice? What does it take to think in systems ways? I've done a lot of thinking. I'm sure there's literature out there. How do you help people think in systems ways, especially I think now when we're challenging folks to think, and I think that we'll look back on this as such an exciting time where people are thinking outside of the silos or their system, to thinking about early childhood, early learning as a broader system that supports young children and families. And so how do we help people think in systems ways? I think there are ways to do that. But I think that's the more challenging things. I think it's easier to train around the concrete things. It's more challenging to give people the skills, but I think you can do that. I think through curriculum, through experiential learning, giving people opportunities then to practice the advocacy skills that they're learning, coming back, and then through a mentorship process. But that would be how I think about that question.
And Shannon, skills and attributes.
Well, my natural answer to this actually probably is very good for the Build conference, because I actually think systems thinking is the #1 thing. Like, I think, and I'm not just saying that because it's the Build conference, like, you know, I think part of the reason that I have had a lot of success was actually because of my master's in social work. And so a master's in social work degree is like all about systems and systems thinking and individual family community thinking together. And so, you know, it's a very natural entry point. I don't think you have to have a social work background. You know, there's many other ways to think like that. But I think helping people see their work in context, and people who are willing to see their work in context, whatever that might be. I mean, at every level, right, your work is in a broader context. So, you know, to me, that's a really important one. And the other thing I think is very hard for our whole field is, how are we informed by the actual experiences of the people in the field? And the reason we have, I mean, I find, like, just taking the position I was in running childcare subsidies, which is the only job, but probably the job I did the longest, there's so much cognitive dissonance involved in the job, because you've got a system that says that the goal is advancement and employment for people and child development, and yet at every turn, everything about the way the system is designed undermines people staying at work, making more money, or being able to access necessarily strong child development, right? So you're living with cognitive dissonance the whole time you're doing the job, right? And so I feel like that, and I think that exists at lots of levels, right? I think people who are in classrooms with different measurements that don't seem to match up to what they think that kids and families really need in this moment probably have that cognitive dissonance. I mean, there's probably a lot of people experiencing that. So I think helping people, but I think if we don't recognize it, we can't get to that underlying, like, assumptions that we're making and how we change it, right? So that's the challenge, is like, to think about it too much will make you crazy, but if you don't face it, what is that I learned from last week? It might have been from Sherry's. If you don't face it, you can't fix it. Was that from the first session? Right. Okay, so that one that we learned on the first session of the Build conference. If you don't face it, you can't fix it. So I would say that's the other thing, willingness to face it.
Well, I want to thank every one of our panelists for being part of it. I want to thank all of you for being part of this session. You know, I can't wait to actually read through all of the chat box to see all of the comments that are there. We are going to share the slides. Build is wonderful about putting the slides out. We're going to share the self-assessment tool. And
Marsha, We had one more question come in. Do you have time for just one more, or do you want to?
I don't know. We have 4 minutes left. Does Bill need to do something at the end?
Well, what I'd like to do is put up the evaluation question, maybe, poll while you're dealing with this last question. That can run over it, okay?
That's great.
How about
Go ahead,
that?
Kate. One last question.
Sure. Okay, so we had one question. It was directed to Shannon, and she started answering it, but I thought it would be maybe good to do it for the whole group, and maybe others have something they want to respond to too. It says, do you know of work that is happening to help leaders develop a racial equity lens in early childhood? And so Shannon, do you want to kind of say what you had started to put in the chat box and see if others have anything to add there?
Yeah, sure. I just was starting to brainstorm some of what I've been looking to lately. So Build, for sure, Sherry, Killen Stewart, and other folks at Build are great resources on this. There's also a children's equity project at Arizona State University led by Marsha and my friend and colleague, Dr. Chantal Meek, and they're going to be producing a seminal report that's going to come out this Thursday that's going to look at equity in several different dimensions, including race equity. And I listed some of the thinkers that have been writing about this lately. Dr. Ioma Iruka, Dr. Stephanie Currington, Dr. Rosemary Allen, there's many more. What y'all might have other thoughts about this though.
Anyone, Khari or Andy? Or Sarah?
This is Andy. I was just going to jump in. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yeah, so I was just going to say I don't have a resource to point people to, only that I think this is the challenge of our time. And I think as we look at being intentional and looking at emergent leadership, it needs to be thought about intentionally as we develop curriculum, as we develop systems that make sure that we have people represented from diverse groups in leadership and are conscious and strategic in the way we do that. I think in the curriculum that we develop, challenging people to look at data and the way that the system is working, and is there evidence of institutional racism that needs to be challenged within that system? Those, I think, are challenges that this next generation of leadership need to be facing. We will do now, but I think as we are supporting and being intentional about supporting those next generation of leadership, I think we need to be challenging them to think in that way and giving them some tools to do that.
This is Sarah. I know that from an evaluation standpoint, there are equity in evaluation. The Equitable Evaluation Project and several others are really diving into what it means to infuse equity into evaluation systems as well. And there are some terrific resources emerging there.
And Khari, I think we've run out of time, so I'm not going to be able to give you a chance to actually talk, but I am going to mention that if you haven't heard Sherry Keelan's session that happened, I think, last week when Bill puts out all of their materials, please go to that website, listen to it. It was really well done, and I think it's a really wonderful way to begin to have those conversations. I want to thank the panelists again. I want to thank Bill for the opportunity to bring this topic. How we squeezed all of this into 75 minutes when it was supposed to be 3.5 hours is somewhat insane. Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to thank our session leaders today for this interesting and informative opportunity. We appreciated the contributions for participants in the chat box, and really a sincere thank you for pulling this session together today for us. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.